Okay, so if I could just remind you that we are videoing this, and I hope that's all right for you, because the one thing we've been very, very, very keen on is that we should be very open and transparent, and there's been a lot of fear about, there's been, I think, a few myths and other issues. But we have been very anxious that the patient groups should really know and see and hear what we're doing, so nothing is hidden. Nobody can come back to us and say, well, we didn't realise, etc. So having taken the evidence from you, the written evidence, having had one session on alerting systems, we now want to go wider, as I say. So, it would be very helpful for us if you could just say who you are, your name and your position in the MHRA, because this needs to go onto the video so that the patient groups, and many, many others, when they're watching this, then can picture what's happening. And then I'll introduce our colleagues around the table. So if you'd like to start.
Hello, I'm Ian Hudson, the CEO of the MHRA.
Right.
I'm Raine. I'm the Director of Vigilance and Risk Management of Medicines at the MHRA, responsible for monitoring safety of medicines in clinical use.
Hello, I'm Woolley, and I'm a Unit Manager within the Benefit Risk Management Group.
Right, thanks very much.
I'm Wilkinson. I'm Director of Devices at the MHRA, responsible for all aspects of regulation of devices in the UK.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Sarah Morgan. I manage the Benefit Risk Management Group, which is within the Vigilance and Risk Management of Medicines Division.
Right, thanks very much. And I think you've got an observer here today, so welcome to you as well. So I'm Julia Cumberledge, and I've been asked by the former Secretary of State whether I would undertake this review into the three items that we've just been talking about. On my left is Sir Cyril Chandler, and he's the Vice Chairman of the review. And the third member of our panel is Simon Webb, and Simon has been concentrating particularly on communications. And then, of course, we need good people around us, and so Valerie Brass, Dr. Valerie Brass is our secretary, and Sonia MacLeod, Dr. MacLeod, who is our senior researcher. So that's us. So if I could start the questions, would that be all right? Or is there anything you want to say first?
If I may, I'd just like to say a few opening remarks, if I may. First of all, to say thank you very much for the opportunity to give evidence to this very important review. We're very much looking forward to seeing the conclusions at the end of the review. We and everyone else are very keen to ensure that patients get the right products at the right time with the right information, so informed decisions can be made. And I and my colleagues have been very moved by the testimony from patients who've been affected by these three interventions: mesh, Valproate, hormonal pregnancy test. I started my professional life working in paediatrics, actually, and prescribed Valproate to children with epilepsy, and I find these stories very moving and appreciate the challenges sometimes on deciding on treatments at an individual patient level. I think it's this very moving testimony from the patients is what the three interventions have in common, although scientifically the issues are a little bit different between them. I did want to make, if I may, 6 points in relation to work that's going on in the agency that's relevant to the review. The first really relates to patient input, but within the MHRA we have to make objective evidence-based decisions taking into account the totality of the evidence available to us. We weigh up the risks and benefits in reaching that judgment and get expert input from independent advisors in doing that. But patient evidence is part of the totality of the evidence that we will consider. And indeed, patients can be very helpful in helping us put into context some of the evidence that we receive. Within the agency, we've got quite a number of mechanisms already for ensuring patient input into our work, whether it's open board meetings, whether it's lay members on our advisory committees, our patient group consultative forum, or the meetings we have with various patient stakeholders. Or we may consult patients. We have consulted patients on, for example, when we want to promote the yellow card scheme to get their input into that. We recognise, I and the senior leadership team within the agency have been discussing this on a number of occasions, including board discussions. We recognise we need to do much more in this regard, and really are planning a much more systematic approach to ensuring patient engagement in our work. And that includes support internally for our staff in terms of being better able to do that, but also horizon scanning, identifying areas at an earlier time point where we want input from patients, and identifying issues perhaps at an earlier time point so we can discuss with them. And then really much more systematic approach to patient engagement. The second area I wanted to cover was really the cross-system working. Our role within the MHRA is the regulation of products, not people, not healthcare systems. So we need to work closely with others across the healthcare system to effect change when there is an issue where change is required. Now, we already do quite a lot in terms of cross-sector work. We have regular meetings with many different players, whether it's GMC, General Pharmaceutical Council, NHS Improvement, the NHS, the safety officers and trust. We do a lot of that, but we recognise there's more that needs to be done in that regard, and really to understand the levers to how to make things happen across the healthcare system. Some of these levers, or many of these levers, are not within the control of MHRA, but we have to understand these levers and work out how we can, across the system, work together to effect change. And I think whether we get into, I'm sure we'll discuss this later, but a ZAR or a National Patient Safety Committee or something like that, we must really focus on this area, I think, and improve its effectiveness across the system. The third area I wanted to touch on was transparency and openness. The agency is committed to transparency and openness, and I think has come a long way in this regard, but also recognises there's more that can be done. We're very keen to be as open as we possibly can be. We've done a lot in terms of our communications, social media, talked about the patient groups. We'll also be pushing for much more transparency through regulation, or indeed voluntary agreements internationally in things like device incidents, making sure that they're available at an earlier time point. The fourth area I wanted to touch on was regulation itself. Regulation has changed considerably over the years since some of these interventions were first introduced. Regulation will continue to evolve. Regulation should follow science. Clearly, as we move into the future, we'll continue to change. And I think we'll have far better tools in the future with things like more registries, databases, artificial intelligence tools, etc., to be able to mine databases such that we have better information at an earlier time point to be able to make informed decisions. The fifth area was to say that the agency strongly supports innovation, but safe innovation, for new products to be developed, brought to patients for the benefit of public health at an appropriate time. But balanced with that has to be appropriate monitoring, appropriate safety, such that innovation can be introduced safely into the healthcare system. And finally, I wanted to mention that we must work with our colleagues internationally. Many of these issues are international in nature. The same drugs, devices are used internationally. Indeed, in the European Union context, things like Valproate have to be handled through the Pharmacovigilance Risk Assessment Committee of the European Union. So we do have to work closely with our European colleagues. So really that's all I wanted to say by way of introduction, apart from to come back to the end of the day, we're here for UK patients to make sure that they get the right products at the right time with the right information, and if things do go wrong, to react promptly across the system to make sure appropriate action is taken, including listening to their voice. So that's all I wanted to say by way of introductory remarks. I don't know, June, I think you wanted to say a few introductory remarks as well.
Well, certainly to echo your thanks to the review for enabling us to focus on Valproate and Primodos hormone pregnancy tests. I've mentioned that my role involves monitoring benefit risk in clinical practice, and the challenges around that we'll no doubt delve into. But as Ian has said, things have moved on very substantially with the availability of real-world data and better methodologies for doing analyses to get robust results from that data. Ian's highlighted the role that patients play at every stage in this. When we consult our Commission on Human Medicines, patients are there. If we need to set up an expert working group, as we'll be talking about with HPTs shortly, the patient voice is heard throughout at every step, and that is integrated into the decisions that are made. So it's a challenging process, integrating all available data. We rely on our independent expert advisory committees, and clearly they advise ministers who take a decision. Ian's mentioned the European nature of the regulatory framework we operate and the need to ensure that Europe also is involved in some of the important decisions, and we'll no doubt talk about that in relation to Valproate. I think overall the key issue is that when we have a robust regulatory position, moving that into action and into clinical practice is something we're really looking to the review to test our thinking on. Yes, we involve the clinical leadership, the regulators and bodies involved in compliance, but what it really takes is for all of those to work consistently together, and we do have some examples of when that coordination and consistency has been achieved, then we achieve prompt action. So I think the models of success should, I hope, involve our lens as we look at where we are now with the important products you're considering in the review.
I think, John, you wanted to...
Yes, I just wanted to pick up on the evolving regulatory systems, particularly in the devices area. The regulatory system is evolving very rapidly. It's worth bearing in mind that the regulations we are using at the moment were first generation European regulations brought in the early 90s, and clearly they were due a substantial review and upgrade, and that indeed has been happening. That said, we haven't sat on our hands in that period, and the agency's been driving a number of changes in the European system, along with other colleagues around Europe. But even under the current legislation, we've introduced joint audits of notified bodies. There was variability of performance of notified bodies. They are supervised nationally, and by definition, nationally supervised bodies might suffer from variability of interpretation of rules and inconsistent performance. So that's changed, and we now have a joint audit scheme which involves both the European Commission and several member states simultaneously. The other big area that we've moved forward is around clinical evidence and evaluation, and there's fourth generation guidance there, which is substantially different from the guidance and expectations that were set in place at the start. Both of those have been consolidated in new regulations, which, as you'll be aware, will come into force in 2020. They also bring substantial increased obligations on both manufacturers and ourselves in terms of monitoring performance of products in the market. So a number of the frameworks that were introduced in 93, 94 are being underpinned with much more substantive and substantial measures to ensure that products are tracked and their performance monitored in practice. I think the other piece, which we've already alluded to, I think in our previous visit, was around transparency. And one, there is going to be better transparency of clinical evidence, but sadly the new regulations didn't go as far as they might have done in terms of transparency around adverse events and other issues which we're pushing to change. So I think, broadly speaking, the legislation is changing. We, in the background, have been working on something that's highly pertinent to the MESH's case, which is around data acquisition and high-quality data, so that we can compare the performance of products and, indeed, interventions across the system. So we were heavily supportive of Scan for Safety and the introduction of UDIs, Unique Device Identifiers, which allows you to electronically connect patients and the products that might have been put into them. We've been working on global standards in that area so that we can pool data internationally. And clearly, in a digital age, there's lots of scope for exploiting new data sets which previously were less than accessible to us. So, and that includes registries, getting information into registries and getting it out in usable form to help us inform decision making. So specifically in relation to MESH, I think that whole area about relative outcomes and relative performance of parts of the system has been particularly challenging. These are complex, often very debilitating conditions with complex presentations, and the picture is far from clear. That could be clearer if the data that we were able to accumulate and analyse would help us to make decisions in the future in a perhaps more timely manner than we have done in the past. I talk about the system as a whole when I say that. I think the long-term implications of all implants are issues of considerable concern. One never knows how any intervention is going to perform over very long-term periods unless you test them for 50, 60, 70 years. And of course, that would exclude their being available. So I think monitoring the performance of particularly implanted products needs to be enhanced in the future. So I think the final thing I wanted to say is that we have extensively interacted with, as you're aware from the evidence, a lot of inquiries, clinical expert groups across the period of time, and largely the advice we've received has been substantially consistent that there is a place for these products in the patient pathway, but the monitoring of performance I think needs considerable improvement.
Well, thank you very much indeed. If I could just pick up one or two things from your presentations. I just want to say on data acquisition, I mean, we are we not, entering a whole new era now where we're going to be able to get much more information, and it'll be technological, and people will be able to assess much more clearly the trends and what's going on. But a comment was made to me by a patient yesterday who said to me, data is important, but please don't forget, in our case, there are children involved. It isn't data, it is people, it is children. So I want to go on then to the patients. And I do understand, and I think, if I may say, you're very slow in the game on this one, but never mind, you clearly want to do things differently in the future. But I'm very conscious that although I'm sure you have extremely good patients on your groups, and they listen and they give you advice and everything that they feel that you should hear. But my experience over many years in the National Health Service is that you get the favoured child, you get the favoured person, you get the person who actually in the end is not perhaps as decisive, as not questioning, as not, because they get encompassed into the organisation. So I just looking at what happened in Scotland on their review, and certainly that ended in great difficulty because they only had 2 patients on the group. What we have done, and I really do recommend it, and we've done it in maternity services as well as with this review, you really need to go out and listen to a lot of people. And it isn't just the ones you trust. You have to hear all the story. And I hope that in the future you will actually do much more of that, because that is what has come through so strongly to us. It is not just 1 or 2 people who are very well informed, and I have to say the patient groups are, they do a lot of research, they're extremely articulate, very good. But actually you also need to hear from a whole range of people. So I hope that's something that maybe in the future you might consider. I just want to ask you about one of the issues that certainly patients have brought forward to us, is about how much you are in the arms of the manufacturers. There really is a feeling about that you are hugely influenced by them. And one of the things that's clearly we would like to know is really how much the MRH is funded by manufacturers. And also, if your funding is from the pharmaceutical and the medical devices industries, should you not have a conflict of interest register, which other organisations do have, not least my own, which is the House of Lords.
Well, if I can answer the factual element of how we're funded, and then we can talk a little bit about conflict of interest and how we manage that. Funded We operate as a trading fund, as the agency, where we receive money from a variety of different sources. On the medicine side, we are virtually all funded through the pharmaceutical industry, that's correct. But on the devices side, we are 95% funded through the Department of Health for the work we do on devices. There's some funding for clinical trials and inspections of notified bodies, but the vast majority of it comes from the Department of Health. And this is a model that many of our similar bodies around Europe and other regulated sectors also follow, that the regulated pay, but certainly the device side is more direct government money. We have very stringent conflict of interest policies. And we use external experts a lot also who don't have interest in the particular companies or products as well. So all our staff have to complete annual declarations of any interest. None of our staff can hold shares or have financial interest in the pharma or devices industries. If we do employ people who come from industry, but then they can't work on that company's products or related products for a period of some 2 years, and if they've been particularly closely involved in a particular product, that goes on indefinitely. And I think it's right that we are able to employ people from industry because we need the expertise to be able to do our job, but it is a very strict conflict of interest policy in terms of what we do. Similarly, we have external advisors through the Commission for Human Medicines and its underpinning external advisory groups, and on the device side, the Device Expert Advisory Committee. And again, very stringent conflict of interest policies here. The CHM, for example, won't allow any interest in the pharma industry in the expert advisory groups. People who might have relevant interests can't participate in the subject under discussion or competing interests. So we work on the basis of managing those interests rather than excluding completely anyone coming from industry, etc. That I don't think would be right, but we do manage them very carefully.
I think that is encouraging, but I mean, do these conflicts of interest, are they very transparent? Are they on websites? Can patient groups, can individuals get hold of them and know exactly who is paying for what?
Certainly the funding of the agency is entirely clear in our annual reports and accounts where it comes from, the different sources, that's clear. Things like our advisory committee structures, the members of CHM, for example, that's all in the public domain in terms of their conflict of interest and the policy there. So yes, that's all available.
Oh, well, that's encouraging. Can I just ask you a very general question, then I'm going to pass on to my colleagues. Who are you accountable to?
I personally report to the Permanent Secretary. In terms of my reporting relationships, I also have a board within the agency, and I have a dotted line, if you like, to the board, but a formal accounting relationship to the Permanent Secretary.
Right. And so do you meet regularly? I mean, what is the relationship like between you and your accountable organisation, which is clearly the government through the Permanent Secretary?
Well, the agency is an arm's length body of the Department of Health. There is a sponsor team within the Department of Health, and one of the Director Generals there, and directors underneath that who are responsible for us from a sort of sponsor and agency point of view. We have a huge amount of interaction between our sponsor team and the agency on an ongoing basis. Yesterday we had our quarterly accountability meeting with our sponsor team where we go through issues, etc. I meet with the Permanent Secretary regularly. I also meet with the Chief Medical Officer regularly. I also meet with the devolved administrations, Chief Medical Officers and Chief Pharmaceutical Officers regularly. But formally, I have an appraisal with the Permanent Secretary once a year, but I meet him in between times. But the day-to-day stuff is done through the sponsor team.
Right, okay, thank you very much. I'm going to then pass on to us.
Well, thank you. And can I say I welcome your opening statement, because it dealt with a number of issues which have emerged and which you've clearly been thinking about. Just to emphasise it, because last time I think I mentioned, it's been a great concern that three things have gone really quite terribly wrong, and people have suffered. And yet it's required the patients and the politicians to bring it to the attention of the system. My profession hasn't brought it to the attention of the system. The system hasn't acknowledged it. So there's something we've got to go away and think about there. And one of the bodies that gave evidence to us, the Epilepsy Society, said, I think it would be right for you to consider whether medically qualified professionals gave sufficient weight to information provided to them in part because this source was from non-medically qualified people. How do you respond to that? I mean, do you think the system and the professions have not given paid adequate attention to what they're hearing from patients?
I think the three interventions are a little different, but I think as I said in my opening statement, what is common is this deeply moving testimony from patients across all three, and I think that's right. I think we do, going forward, have to make sure across the whole system we do more to listen to patients. Certainly on Valproate, I know, June, you've said to me that when we, early on when we were meeting patient groups, they really brought the neurodevelopmental delay home to us in terms of what it actually meant, in terms of a figure of IQ on the scale versus actually what this really means for a person affected. And absolutely we've got to do more of this. Absolutely we've got to listen to patients more as part of the process. We've got to look at the totality of the data, of course we have, and we've got to weigh up the risks and benefits, but absolutely patient voice has to be heard because it really can bring it to life what it actually means for someone.
You mentioned the notion of a patient safety SAR in your introduction statement. Is that because the MHRA really relates more to the manufacturers and the industry rather than to patients? Do you feel there's a gap there?
No, I don't. It's more because, and indeed I look at the people in the agency, many of whom have got a healthcare professional background, physicians, pharmacists, etc., and really the motivation for people working in the agency is to do the right thing for patients and the public. But the question, I think the challenge for us all is how to affect things across the whole system, so that if an issue arises, how to make sure it happens across the whole system such that action is taken, so when a patient sees their doctor, that they have the appropriate information, the appropriate conversation, and action is taken at that level. So it's, what I'm really thinking about is what are the mechanisms for joining up the different players in the system such that we can act in a coordinated way, such that if we identify an issue, we are not the person sitting in front of the patient when they come and see their doctor, if it's an epileptic, and deciding on whether to prescribe Valproate or not, but to make sure that the system is joined up so that action is taken. So it's not so much our way of facing, it's much more to join up the system.
When we had a meeting about, which we'll come to later on today, about registers and the pause, I asked a question at that meeting around what happens if there's a concern about a product. Do you raise that with the patient agencies, and the answer I got, which I may have misunderstood, was that no, the MHRA can't do that. They have to go to the industry and talk to them about it. And I said, well, why don't you share it with patients? They said, I understood them to say, well, no, that's not what we're allowed to do within the law.
Well, what we are able to do and what we will do, and it's a little different than the legal situation for medical devices, but we take safety issues from patients through the yellow card system, and I think they're the single biggest reporting group now, patients above health, certainly above GPs and doctors.
Is this the yellow card?
Yes, through the yellow card. We will take reports of issues from patients. We have on a number of occasions over the years, in both, well, many occasions of Valproate and also met with patient groups and HPT as well, met with the patient groups to talk about the issues get their involvement. Then if we identify an issue, we'll want to look at the totality of the data. The totality of the data, yes, we'll go to the manufacturers and say, could you tell us about what you know about your product and safety information. We may also look at literature reviews from wherever they come from. We'll look at the yellow cards, which will come from patients or clinicians or pharmacists or whoever they come from. We'll look at the totality of the data. We'll then consult with our external advisory groups.
But if you had an issue which wasn't about whether the device itself was properly manufactured and safe, but its use in the system,
right,
and patients were in any form at risk, what would you do?
We would talk to, I think it depends where it's coming from, but if we're aware of an issue with a particular device...
Coming from patients.
It's coming from patients, but I think then we would then need input from a range of different people and then to discuss with a range of different people, and that would, yes, include the manufacturers. It would also include the professions, the surgeons, for example, if appropriate. To date, we have met with patient groups in some of these areas, but this is an area that we plan to do more systematically for issues at an earlier stage. But we have met early on with Meshes United and patient groups there. But we will do this more systematically. But we'll talk to whoever we think is necessary to discuss the issue, decide who needs to do what, and then provide advice, and that may be joint advice between ourselves and the profession, or it may come directly from us. It depends what it is.
Right, well, perhaps we can return to this when we talk about mesh this afternoon, because it's
sure,
particularly relevant there. Okay. Can I ask you one other question? You'll be aware that the BMJ at the end of last year carried an article from the Society of Investigative Journalists about lobbying blocked European safety checks for dangerous medical implants, and Simon Bowers wrote a report. Mm-hmm. What's your view of that?
Well, I think the devices regulations have been have evolved over time. We've had a set of regulations that have been in place for quite a number of years. We've renegotiated and they came into force a whole new set of regulations in 2017 that are in a transition phase of coming in. They address a number of areas where regulation needs to move on to deal with new approaches, new technologies, need for greater vigilance, etc. So I think that the new regulations address many of the areas that have been highlighted as concern by others in the past. So we are in the phase of transitioning to those new regulations. But I can go through what some of the changes are, but it's not...
The particular point, as I understand it, is that actually lobbying has actually interfered in some way with the process of approval or non-approval of medical devices.
I'm not aware of that.
You're aware of the paper, then?
I'm aware of the paper, but my experience within the agencies, we've always taken a data-driven approach. We've always then science-driven approach with expertise as required.
I don't think it was criticising you. I think it was saying that when they developed the new regulations.
Oh, I see.
The lobbying.
Well, of course, industry. The regulations went out for consultation. Of course, industry would have had a view, but in fact, it was many aspects of the regulation are things that we UK have been wanting and pushing for some considerable period of time. So, of course, industry will comment on the regulations. Other groups also are expected to comment on the regulations. But these are areas where we've been pushing for some considerable period of time. I don't know, John, if there's anything you want to add on.
Well, can I just underline that point? So, are you comfortable, are you content that the regulations that are going to be brought into effect in 2020 are as you would wish them to be? Or do you want to go further?
By and large, yes. I mean, I think the one area that we've talked about earlier was the openness, transparency bit, where I think we'd have liked to have seen a little bit more in terms of the ability to talk about some of the signals at an earlier time point formally. But other than that, I think by and large, yes, I think the regulations are good regulations and will be appropriate.
And on the transparency point, you've often found yourself saying that there are things you can't disclose to people who approach you because of confidentiality agreements with manufacturers. Is that a frustration or just a fact of life?
It's not a confidentiality agreement with the manufacturer. It's the legislation that says that basically whilst things are at an early stage in investigation, there is a duty of confidentiality to manufacturers. John, is there anything you want to add on this?
No, I mean, I think we are often embarrassed by the fact that we have to, if you like, appear to hide behind Article 20 of the Medical Devices Directives, which preclude us disclosing the nature of conversations we're having with manufacturers at any one time. And I think I think there's some merit in not being completely transparent about every interchange that happens while you're doing an investigation, otherwise that investigation could be compromised. But ultimately, those provisions go too far. And certainly the provisions around publication of adverse events and the information around those, I think there is no reason why those shouldn't be in the public domain.
So do you have specific proposals for changing?
We have been working with industry to introduce a voluntary scheme outside of the legislation.
Right.
That is showing promise. There seems to be in principle agreement that would be a good idea from the major industry players, and that would be a fairly powerful lever potentially to change the legislation in due course. So I think we're doing everything we can, outside of the constraints of the legislation to try and move.
Do you have a publicly position on that we could see?
I think I'd be very happy, and I have to consult with my colleagues who are working on this. We've put a number of papers into the European Commission and the European system in support of this.
Because you did mention one of your points was more openness.
Yes, sure. Well, shall we write to you on this specific point?
I think that
might
really
be
helpful.
Can I just ask, in terms that this is something you would obviously like to see?
Yes.
There has just been an overhaul of the regulations relatively recently. So what prevented this from being incorporated into the new regulations?
Well, you have to bear in mind that the development of European legislation is a sort of tripartite activity. Mm-hmm. The Commission put out a consultative document at the front end, and at the back end everybody has to agree. The Commission are the facilitators, if you like, but the Parliament, which has 29 I get confused at the moment in terms of 28 member states in it, net of ourselves. You have the Council of Europe, which is all of the member states, and ultimately all have to agree on the nature of these provisions, and clearly that's a complex process. So while we may have strong opinions, if that's not shared by other member states, and indeed the Parliament, then we have limited influence. We try to influence as much as we can on things we think are important, but ultimately it's a political process.
Thank you very much.
Can I just ask on the volunteer element? So you could have just one or two manufacturers saying, well, we will join in with this, and then you're left with a larger number who don't want to.
I think it would be difficult to proceed if you didn't have a substantial core of large manufacturers. And it's the large manufacturers that put, in terms of volume of products, the majority of products on the market. So you could go a very long way towards the goal with an agreement with the large manufacturers. And I think that would increasingly pressurise the others to fall in line as well. So I think, the approach is to seek a start to break the logjam and move the thing forward, and hopefully that will move quite quickly.
That sounds a good idea.
Can I just ask about something you mentioned in your opening statement? I think you said that there's a need for better cross-system working. Yep. That's certainly something that we've got a view on as well. Yes. Who's responsible for ensuring the system acts in a more coherent way?
That's a very difficult question. And we've been having discussions with NHS Improvement in relation to this, and indeed across the other bodies through the Department of Health, having some discussions here. ultimately, at the moment, we all have different roles, and we either come together in some sort of overarching committee that has all the elements there to affect change, or we end up with another structure. But I think that the difficulty at the moment is our responsibility is clearly defined, but it's not the whole system. Other people have other responsibilities. So what I want to see is certainly if we say there is an issue and communicate it extensively through the system, then that system picks it up and somehow mandates that a change happens with CQC monitoring at the end to ensure that it has happened.
Is there a ringmaster or a conductor of this orchestra?
This I think will be one of the key areas for your review and recommendations, I think, to reflect on the best way of doing this, whether it is some sort of overarching committee that has responsibility for this or some other route.
But at the moment, are you saying there is no...
I think
there's no one who sets the direction of travel on how to ensure better cross-system integration?
Well, my expectation had been where we communicate on an issue, Valproate, for example, and we send out the materials, pregnancy prevention plan and all the rest of it, that immediately everyone would take action. What I'm deeply troubled by is stories that sometimes that isn't getting everywhere across the system, and this is the basis of some of the patient testimony that we've heard. And therefore, I suppose the question I'm trying to ask is how, across the system, with all the players, with the levers that are there, can that system be made better? And is it some sort of overarching safety committee? That might be the answer, and certainly we've had some discussions with NHS Improvement in relation to they're creating NAPSAT, this National Patient Safety Committee, to accredit alerts going out, and whether that then changes into an overarching safety committee for the system. That might be a way forward.
But today, as things stand, if you've got a concern about something that's not working, something that's not happening as it should,
yes,
where do you take your concern?
Well, what we have done here is we've communicated ourselves, and then we've enlisted the support of chief medical officers, or we've gone round to, things like Valproate, I and the chair of the agency have gone round to all the Royal Colleges and say, please will you reinforce this with all your members. We've issued alerts with NHS Improvement, for example, a joint one. Chief medical officers done that. We've also got the chief pharmaceutical officers to write to the pharmacists with myself on areas that perhaps we felt more needed to be done. So at the moment it's a little bit, we go to the bodies that we think can work with us to affect change, and I think this is an area that I would like to see improve going forward.
And how would you describe the Department of Health and Social Care's role in the system at present?
Well, I think they have a key role because they're responsible for all the parts of the system, putting it together. So I think they'll need to describe their own role in this, but I certainly, we had a meeting recently with the department that the department pulled together with the various players, and I think that's a very welcome step.
Has it ever been different?
Has it ever been different?
Putting the ring together.
What I found challenging is the stories from patients where they're saying they didn't know, and I've been doing this in one form or another for a long period of time, and that really deeply troubles me that somehow it's not getting through. Now, is that I wasn't aware of it not happening before, or is that more a new phenomenon that everyone is, I think everyone is trying to do their best in a very busy environment.
But I think that's part of the problem. You see,
yes,
we're hearing this from you, and we've heard it from others, and one's left thinking, after all these years, it's still not working. And every time there comes to be a problem, it's this ad hoc, who do we speak to, let's try to get this sorted.
Yes.
It just bothers us a little bit that we've taken so long to say, right, we need to get the system to play together, we need the orchestra to sound together.
Well, I think the NAPSAT, National Patient Safety Committee, through NHS Improvement is a welcome advance, where we'll be all operating the same way in terms of the alerts going out, in terms of who they go to the board, etc. There's other players, of course, the healthcare system, the HSIB investigatory branch as well, who are looking at particular topics and saying
so long.
Yes, well, I'm not sure I can answer the question why it's taken so long. What I would say is I'm pleased to see that some of the changes and some of the things that are proposed now.
Can I just ask one other question? The CHM, I've been looking
Yes.
at their sort of terms of reference.
Right.
They are not, as I understand it, responsible for investigating regulatory failings. Who is?
Well, the agency's remit is really public health issues. Now, I don't think that's an agency issue nor a CHM issue to look at that. So I think a separate mechanism would have to be put in place to investigate regulatory failures. I think we're
So we don't have anyone at the moment who should be responsible for looking into regulatory failings.
Well, I think the focus certainly on our current work is much more on dealing with the issues and going forward rather than going back over things in the past. So no, I don't think that's... I mean, courts, of course, legal systems, of course, but outside of that, there isn't a body that would now be looking back and say, did the system do the right thing then or not? Is that a failure or not? No.
Do you think there's a role there for Parliament in that respect? Because there are other agencies like the Ombudsman's agency where they report to a select committee that is responsible for the work that they're doing. I mean, one of the great difficulties with all this is we have so many different agencies and different component parts to the health service, as we know, not least triggered by the 2012 Act, which actually made arm's length bodies and all the rest of it. So there's always a temptation to say, well, actually, we could bring it all together if we have another overarching body. And then in the end, we sort of deepen the bureaucracy, which is actually not what we want. But it just, I mean, I'm just sort of trying to think of things that would be of help to you and to all the other agencies in trying to bring it much more together and perhaps more accountable. And it seems to me there could be an accountability to Parliament in terms of having a select committee that deals with some of this, but you may think that only deepens the bureaucracy.
Well, formally the licensing authority is the Minister, the Health Minister, Secretary of State, and we are acting on behalf of ministers, and indeed many things are done, are sent up to ministers for their agreement. We also have an accountability to Parliament. I have appeared in front of a number of select committees, particularly on certain topics, and indeed the Health Select Committee wants to look at something, then we may well be asked to go and appear in front of them and account for what's been happening. There are a number of all-party parliamentary groups as well that we meet on a regular basis to talk about areas of interest to the review. So there is quite a lot of parliamentary activity and responsibility now. I think the question you come to is another overarching body versus a sort of more coordinated committee. I think it's difficult. I think another overarching body, as you say, adds a layer of bureaucracy, but maybe a cross-agency, cross-relevant body committee with specific responsibility for safety and ensuring action is taken that doesn't create another tier, if you like, maybe a way to go. I don't know. I think that's the challenge.
Shall we go on to Primidos? Is that all right? Okay. Well, you know the history of Primidos and the tragedies that have occurred. And of course, it is now very much in the past, thank goodness, but we are still meeting the young people, or even getting on in the years a bit, who've been affected by this medication that was given to patients, given to women who were being tested for pregnancy, of course, whether they were pregnant or not. So patients have actually been saying to us, where was the warning? Why wasn't there a warning that women were told at the time that this could have had an effect? I mean, was it simply that there wasn't the information there? Was this just thought to be a good idea? How did this all come about?
Well, this was what was being done at the time. This was the way of diagnosing pregnancy, if you like, at the time, until the alternate tests came along and replaced the hormonal pregnancy tests. There was conflicting data at the time. in relation to these birth defects, and there was a warning added of possible birth defects, and new tests came along in due course. What we've done since then on a number of occasions, and I think you've spoken to Dr. Gabay and the expert group, but the agency has, and then ministers asked for an expert group to be convened to look at the totality of the data and to see really basically whether the hormone pregnancy test was causing the birth defects. And I think you've seen both in our written evidence and you've heard from Dr. Gabay in terms of their findings. So clearly these are tests that are used in the 70s, in the conditions of the 70s and not now, but certainly our role more recently has been to review the totality of that data and then to listen to the expert group that was convened and their findings. They didn't find that the totality of the data supported the causal association between the
So we will learn from that.
Well, well, I think the expert group also came up with a number of recommendations in relation to medicines in pregnancy more generally. And these recommendations are across a broad range of areas. I think there's something like 13 different recommendations, and we're working very hard to take those recommendations forward. I should also say that regulation has moved on a long way since hormonal pregnancy tests were first introduced in the 50s and 60s until they were eventually withdrawn in 1978, I think. June, is there anything you want to add on this?
Yes, certainly. Baroness Cumberledge's question goes to warnings, and of course there's a historic element here about how they would have reached anybody, but I think the heart of the question is a warning should be based on the evidence of safety. And excuse me, I think the important point is that question has been looked at on a number of occasions, but the review that we've done is the most rigorous ever undertaken. And I think the reason that we devoted such care and attention to sifting thousands of pieces of evidence is that it was a very important question for the women themselves. So we fully recognise what you've been seeing and hearing, and to involve the patient's perspective right throughout that, as every piece of evidence was looked at, was our commitment. And I hope that shines out of the report. I think your second point about learning from this, yes, we've learned a very great deal about how the patient perspective is involved. We did our best to make sure that their involvement was not a difficult one, but we knew it would be daunting, and despite best efforts, there were elements of distress that we deeply regret and would wish to move on to do things rather differently. I think we learned a rather important message about the communication of science when the science isn't what people expect to hear. And that, I have to say, is one of the big challenges, and not alone for this class of medicines. We see vaccines and other areas where the basis of our work in rigorous science is really critical to public health. And the findings of your report, your review, are so important here. And then I think the third area is what Ian has just mentioned, and our cross-sector group, which is a model in a way of what we've just talked about, to bring together all parties with a commitment to improve medicines in pregnancy. Whether it's from the very first development, how we test for teratogenicity, whether it's the modelling of the dose the woman should have. It's an astonishing fact that only 5 medicines have been tested for their effects in a pregnant woman. So the confidence a woman has when she takes what her doctor orders for her infection or whatever just isn't there, and we're going to do something about that. We have an information consortium of all the information providers who are going to ensure that wherever a woman turns to for information or advice, she'll get clear and well-constructed advice for her. And every signal that happens in a pregnant woman will be looked at. So I hope I've conveyed that this is really happening, and it will only happen if the clinical world, science and academia, and funding bodies come together to fill this gap. The concept, as we did with paediatrics, of filling a really important gap. I think we're on the right track because the National Institute of Health in the US is on the same track, and we'll work with them. So this report should be seen as a really important contribution to women's health for the future. And while there are very difficult aspects of the science that was looked at by the experts you've talked to, our mind is open to all further evidence that accrues, as you would expect from a scientific body. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Just ask on that basis, in terms of going back and saying we were looking at warnings, one of the things that struck me is that the Committee for the Safety of Drugs weren't entirely comfortable with hormone pregnancy tests, but they didn't consider there was sufficient evidence. I haven't seen a sort of risk-benefit analysis in the way that I would have expected to have seen it. And certainly, in terms of the benefits of hormone pregnancy tests, given there were alternative testing available, how was it weighed, and how would that have changed in the intervening time?
I thank you for focusing on the context at that time. What we understand is that the society aspects weren't as wanting an instant diagnosis perhaps as much as we do now, and the use of the alternative tests was very time consuming and probably not very accessible to most people, which is why when the test that you get now with a simple urine test in the pharmacy or wherever has made such a difference. The other context was the regulatory context itself, and I'll turn to Dr. Woolley on this. There was never a licence for these things. The only licence that was ever granted was for the amenorrhea indication. So all the rigours of what we would do now simply weren't there. And we would have said, as we would do with any investigation, that this is a healthy person having something for which it's a test. Knowledge is an important thing, but it's still a test. And therefore, the benefit risk would be rather finely balanced and any risk unacceptable. May I ask Dr. Woolley just to clarify any points you'd like to raise on that?
No, I think you've covered it all. I think the indication was removed in 1970 and at the time it got its licence.
Yes, and we were the first along with Norway.
Absolutely, although it wasn't the Committee for the Safety of Drugs that removed the indication, was it?
It was the McGregor.
McGregor.
Yeah.
Do we know why the McGregor Committee? I mean, it's very difficult going back over a generation. I do not understand that, and it's only worth doing if we can learn something for the future. But do we know why the McGregor Committee did remove it in 1970?
It might have been because it was a diagnostic test and they didn't reimburse diagnostic tests in those days. So they said you can only have this drug in the proprietary index if you remove that indication.
So is it likely that's the reason that patients wouldn't be informed of the change?
I think so, because I think it was just a commercial decision at the end of the day by shearing, certainly from documents I've seen, that based on that recommendation by the McGregor Committee, they thought it wasn't worth having that as an indication.
I don't want to put difficult hypothetical questions to directly, but you know, given the fact that the committees discussed the possibility of the teratogenetic effect between 67 and 75, do you think in the modern world, and I was a doctor then and I know doctoring has changed hugely over that period, do you think nowadays it's likely that their anxieties would have been shared with patients rather than suppressed on the basis that we shouldn't? I'm not trying to feed you.
No, shared decision making is the way that medicine is practiced now.
Yes.
I think in those days, and I wouldn't want to use words like paternalistic, but there was a very great deal that the doctor would then decide what a woman needed to know, in a sense taking her role. And it was particularly apparent, I think, in obstetrics and gynecology, if I may say. But nowadays, this would be unthinkable that somebody didn't have a part to play in that decision and know the pros and the cons. We have to put our minds back to the time when, particularly I think in obstetrics and gynecology, that there was a rather more need-to-know basis, and particularly there was one quote that came to mind: if a woman is pregnant, she needs to hear it from a doctor. So that, I think, tells you that the whole idea that a woman might wonder if she was or not and be able to find out for herself was really not there.
Thank you. Going back to what you were just saying about the future, and the EWG recommended the MHRA should systematically monitor outcomes after taking important regulatory action to protect patients' from harmful medicine, use this information to inform action. Does that mean that the MHRA holds the ring in this area? We've just had a conversation about who holds the ring in other areas and patient safety, but you are in charge.
The really important framework change when the Vigilance, the safety monitoring regulations were overhauled in 2012 was the responsibility, a power that we welcomed to monitor the effectiveness of risk minimisation. And it meant a whole change in emphasis with a pharmacoepidemiology team and data sources that would enable us to do this. And we'll talk about some of the challenges, particularly with Valproate, in how we approach this, in getting the right data, the right parameters to inform judgments on whether risk minimisation is working. So that, I hope, tells you that for the holding the ring on a regulatory decision on safety then flows through to monitoring that, and in a cyclical way taking steps to improve it if necessary. We always strive, I think, to be proportionate. It's simply a phrase because we never want to deprive someone who is going to benefit from the medicine from over-restricting it. So it's a case of judging the populations in whom the benefit risk may be in question and approaching that in a way that we can measure whether it has achieved the right public health outcome. We've published a bit about this approach with some key decisions, and I think our wish now, and I think I did mention it last time, is to be very systematic about the goal of a risk minimising step and when it's achieved. Sometimes a change in clinical practice will require many factors to deliver that public health goal, and we're getting better at using new disciplines like implementation science to identify those goals and to have the data streams and studies that will help us. So when we talk about Valproate, I hope we'll talk about some of the studies that are happening in Europe right now, but I know the review will reflect on the timeframes for those.
But that would also reflect the need for these conversations to involve the patient as well as patients.
At the very beginning, on the judgment as to what risk minimising efforts are acceptable and what goal is the one they see as appropriate.
When you come to prescribe, you'd expect the prescriber to discuss these with the patient.
Yes, indeed.
I have to say one of the real tragedies, the legacy of all what went wrong, is that when we've met a lot of women and their husbands and partners and everything, the feeling of guilt, the guilt in the woman that she caused this disablement to her child. It is very real. And we just have to think about what we can do about it, because we try and persuade them you are not guilty, but they don't believe that. So it's really, I mean, we've obviously got to go forward in medicine, I understand that, and in devices and other things, but actually we do have to think about the harm that's been done as well.
Can I have one more?
Sorry.
And this is my last one. We talked about this to the EWG. The sponsor of the EWG was you or the CHN?
The minister asked for an independent group.
Now, I am used to, I know there are other ways of doing it, but I'm quite used to the notion of the National Academy of Medicine in Washington, when they do a report, they also put a peer review group in place to look at the report and before it's actually released. This didn't happen in this case, so it could have done. There are similar places in this country that could have happened. Do you think that was a mistake?
Well, actually there was the expert advisory group did do their work and produce their report, and then it was reviewed by the Commission for Human Medicine.
I know it was, but
that
was,
in a way is a
yes, that's the answer they gave.
Yes.
But as I say, in other jurisdictions, a separate committee would have been established, for example, by the Institute of Medicine, was now the National Academy of Medicine, to peer review the report before it was released.
Well, June, you may want to comment, but I mean, certainly the process of the 9 experts looking at all of this for eminent people, then an independent review by the Commission, well, feeding into the Commission who...
Well, they're not the sponsor of it.
well, the sponsor of it, but they're not the people who wrote the report.
No, I know
they
that.
did scrutinise
But
it.
they're still the sponsor.
And that was the advice that came through. So I think it was a robust process, a very robust process. But June, do you?
I think we need to reflect a little further that there are aspects of our work, particularly on access to medicines, where we would do a public consultation on a proposal and get wider input into it. And I think we probably need to reflect a
So you
little
could have
further.
asked the Academy of Medical Sciences to...
There's no doubt that the CHM provided a very rigorous review.
Thank you.
Can I just explore a bit more about warnings in relation to, specifically in relation to Primodos, but obviously it's a wider context. So in the case of Primodos, there were concerns about the product, and those concerns were voiced informally, I think from the late 1960s through into the 1970s. But as we've discussed already, the science then and the science now doesn't reach a consensus on causality. So I'm trying to understand at what point, if you were to wind forward to today and you had a similar situation where you've got concerns that are raised, including in that case by certain individuals within the company that manufactured the product, at what point should the receiver, the recipient, the patient, the woman in this case, be made aware of those concerns when the science isn't overwhelmingly in favour of causality?
I think the world has moved on considerably, and the practice of medicine has moved on considerably since the 70s, and June, you were referring to the perhaps more paternalistic approach then, but I think now in any pregnant woman and a decision to give her a medicine or not would have to be a careful consideration of all the available evidence and a proper discussion whether that's the right treatment for her at that time.
But as you've mentioned, there's limited scientific knowledge about the effect of medicines given to a woman.
Sure, so if there are uncertainties, that has to be part of the discussion.
So it would be today, and it wasn't then.
I wasn't practicing medicine in the 60s, 70s, but...
Well, I mean, the women we've spoken to who took Primodos and who then subsequently had children who were damaged, certainly weren't... what they've told us is that they were not warned of any risk or any concern that existed at the time, and they took the pill on that basis.
Well, my expectation now is if there's a pregnant woman, and indeed non-pregnant women or men or whoever, in terms of any discussion about the risks and benefits of a treatment before they embark on that treatment in the context of the disease they have. So, and I think medicine has moved on tremendously in that respect, from certainly when I qualified, which was 1982, I think, but from then onwards it was much more paternalistic and a view of not being quite so forthright in terms of information, to now where I think there's a much, much greater, and rightly so, expectation that people are properly discuss and a shared decision making.
Do you think there's a willingness for people in the system, and clinicians included, maybe specifically clinicians, to say to a woman who's pregnant who they think needs to take a certain medication, I do not know what effect this might have on you or the unborn child? What
I expect them to say is that clearly you've got this condition, you need this treatment, this is what we know about it, and this is what we don't know about it.
And do you think that happens?
I'm not the best person to judge that.
Who's the best person to judge?
I think the people who are treating patients are the best people to judge that, but that's what I would expect should happen.
Who within the system is best to...
Well, I think the people who are actually treating the pregnant...
So individual clinicians?
Yeah, well, yes, and the professional societies should be the people who perhaps are best able to answer that question.
Surely the person best positioned to judge it is the recipient of the information, because they are the person who should know if they receive that information.
Yes, I agree. It should be a joint decision, if you like, that between the healthcare professional and the patient. Absolutely.
But who in the system, I mean, which part of the system then knows that the patient has been given the information that they needed to in order to make an informed decision, and that therefore the system is operating as it should? Which organisation within the system is responsible for knowing that that's happening or isn't happening, and taking action to ensure that it does?
Well, I think there's a professional responsibility on the healthcare professionals to go through a consent process. Now, for surgical processes, that's recorded and written down, or etc. But if you're prescribing something, and if I go to my GP with something, I expect there's a professional responsibility there. Certainly, if there are then issues with that, and that's going to come up through complaints, revalidation, all of that side of things, if there are issues relating to that. But I think it's primarily a professional responsibility to ensure that there is this proper discussion of the risks and benefits of any intervention. June,
perhaps I could add something about thinking about what we can add to this. And we're very conscious, and have been for a long time, that the leaflet and what we call the summary of product characteristics probably isn't as helpful as it could be. And in fact, when the legislation was overhauled in 2010 to 12, there was a commitment by the Commission to look at the shortcomings. And we did a bit of a study ourselves, looking at what we call a risk management plan, which is a document that covers what is known, what isn't known, what might be expected to happen with a particular medicine. And in fact, patients preferred that kind of information to the standard, what's been in place for a long time, leaflet or SPC. And the opportunity exists. I think the European agency hasn't quite maximised that opportunity to publish things. So in a way, in an ideal world, the health professional would be informed by that distilled knowledge of what's known and what's not known, and be able to just talk through it with a woman saying, well, I'm in my first pregnancy, what do you know about people in their first? And they would have that in their system at their fingertips and be able to say, well, we've studied 1500 and this is what we know, these are the gaps. And I think that whole dialogue could be informed by a distilled, embodied piece of information. That would be really what we would like to work towards.
Can I ask you a specific question about the summary of product characteristics? And just tell me if I've got this right, because I think that you cited in your evidence, this is based on European Commission guidelines, that adverse events without at least a suspected causal relationship should not be listed in the SPC. So if we look now at a modern day contraceptive pill, which we found that contains both norepinephrine and ethinyl estradiol, I find difficulty pronouncing those. But anyway, they're the same components of Primodos, albeit at different constituents, ingredients, at different concentrations. This particular product characteristic information sheet lists pregnancy as a contraindication and gives a special warning that an increased risk of congenital abnormalities has been reported following the use of sex hormones in pregnancy. So does that mean there is the causal, suspected causal association? Because it's there.
Let's go back and take it in steps if we may. I think the European guideline, unlike what happens in the US, states that should be at least a reasonable
suspected
likelihood that there's a causal association. So we don't just put everything that happens. However, because many of the updates that we put in this summary of product characteristics emanate from the US, many companies will be following the guidelines there. So we have quite a job to do in Europe to make sure that what the information to the woman is has a reasonable likelihood of helping her, rather than just being a coincidental thing that happens. In terms of the contraceptive pill, and again I'd like to turn to Dr. Woolley on this, we have to understand too that there are certain aspects of use of these hormones that may result in a change to the fetus. And that may not be quite the test that we're applying to Primodos here today, because of the other aspects that you might like to talk about, fertilization and so forth. So could I pass to Jane to tell you a little bit about that?
You can see there is a confusion, and one might look at this and then say, well, how does that square with the findings, obviously, of the EWG report?
Yes, it's a slightly different question.
Yeah, well, not least because actually there is somewhere in the summary, and I'm sure that I've read this right, and no doubt you will tell me if I got it wrong, that in fact there is a statement in the EWG report that says, findings of the review for HPTs, including Primodos, on a possible association between exposure in pregnancy to HPTs and adverse outcomes in pregnancy, do not have implications for any currently licensed medicine. They are, in fact, considered to be reassuring for women who may inadvertently become pregnant while taking these hormones for contraception or gynecological conditions. And yet here we have a modern-day contraceptive which is saying very specifically a contraindication for pregnancy, and actually there is reported association with malformations.
Yes, I think that warning refers to virilizing effects of
No, it doesn't. It
does
refers
not.
to congenital heart defects. Yes, it's there if you like.
Okay. I can't, I don't know what
So
We'd
maybe
like to
you-
look into that
I
and
think
provide you a
that would
full
be very
explanation.
fantastic.
And I think the other context is that clearly the expert group would have been aware of some other studies where women did take one of these pills inadvertently throughout pregnancy and did not have an increase. So
But it would
we'll
be
look into
helpful.
the context for this particular pill. And I would say I'm glad you've raised it because it is so important that women are confident in what advice they get.
Can I just tell you that in fact we've heard from the Association for Children Damaged by Hormone Pregnancy Tests that actually when they came to give evidence to the expert working group, they felt that actually they weren't treated very well, that they felt that there could have been better interaction between the expert working group and also this the patient group. Are there ways that you could do this sort of thing differently?
Absolutely, and we want to. The understanding that this would be daunting was fully appreciated, and the understanding that people needed time to tell their stories and feel that there was an engagement. Interestingly, when we look at the, if you like, the evidence that we have is that people did have a reasonable amount of time and did have some questions to show, it's not to show, that indicated the engagement and the interest. But I think we do need to go further than that. And I speak in my former life as someone who's privileged to take 2 public hearings, and there's probably nothing more daunting than that. And the preparation that was individualised that the European agency was able to give meant that women could come and feel very comfortable and deliver what they wanted to get across. So that's the big message, and Ian has spoken about how we will be training our staff, we will be setting them goals, so that anyone who comes to visit us to give their views and their experiences feels totally comfortable, and that the surroundings and the daunting nature of the experience doesn't impede them or upset them. And I can only say that yesterday I was meeting with a patient group, and the conversation, and Mrs. Morgan was with me, was of equals, was of information we needed to share to pursue the goal that we all embrace. So it can be done. The resources, the time, the training will be put into that, and I'd like to give you that assurance.
Oh, thank you very much. Right. Anybody else before we move on?
Just one question. One of the things that we have had raised quite consistently from patient groups is that the indication was for hormone pregnancy test was removed in 1970, but it took until 1975 for a contraindication to be added. And just really questions about that gap, and is that gap normal? Why was there a gap? And should there not have been such a gap?
I would like to say that today there wouldn't be such a gap, absolutely not, but the rigours of the procedures and the standards of performance that we have now were certainly not even imagined then. Jane?
I think, obviously I've only seen minutes and extracts and putting things together, but I think the CSM at the time wanted to be sure of their own data, and that's why it took till 1975.
I mean, just as a follow-on from that, it's rather odd because, the indication had already been removed. It's slightly odd 5 years later to put a contraindication on the drug as a pregnancy test if it had already been removed.
Well, I think that's because it was still used in secondary amenorrhea, and so women could have actually been pregnant and taking it for a different reason, and so they wanted to make sure that.
Yes.
So I think women were supposed to have a pregnancy test first and then take it.
And then take that, because of course that raises the other point for me, was the actual dosage for the treatment of secondary amenorrhea, and indeed the way it was licensed is exactly the same as taking the test as a pregnancy test, as taking the drug as a pregnancy test. So one's sort of left wondering whether anyone would have known it would stop being used as a pregnancy test, because of course when you do a prescription you don't actually say what you're putting it on for, and it's exactly the same dosage.
And I think that was one of the big complaints as well, or that people were still being prescribed it even though it wasn't licensed for that indication.
And no one would have been able to check them because no one would have known that's what it was licensed for.
Can I just ask a question about the expert working group, which we've already discussed? Some of the concerns that have been raised with us by patient group, are around the conflicts of interest of the EWG members. I know we've talked about conflicts of interest within MHRA, but this is a specific point about the EWG itself. What was your role in commissioning and selecting those members of the EWG?
They were selected by CHM, weren't they?
Commission on Human Medicines would have approved the membership, and when someone's name is discussed as a person who has the right expertise and experience to add value, given the question that the group is going to answer, they are sent a clear statement of policy on this and asked to provide information about their own activities. I don't know if Jane would like that. That's at the moment when they're asked if they would be available to serve. Jane, do you want to add to that?
The only other thing to add is that the expert working group themselves could also, at the first meeting, were given an opportunity to say if there were any areas that they felt were lacking that needed to be filled, and also Mr. Dobrick was an invited expert as well at the request of Mrs. Lyon, so she also had some input into the membership group.
We've been told that one of the members of the EWG has been paid to do work by Cheering Bear. I don't know whether you can confirm that or not.
I can confirm it, but we didn't know that at the very first meeting. Mrs. Lyons did tell us, and we looked into it. He confirmed it, and then he was
Should you not
stepped
have
down.
should you not have inquired about their conflicts of interest?
Oh, we did, and they had to sign.
And they didn't declare the conflict of interest.
No, I don't know if there was a misunderstanding, but no.
Oh.
There's another member of the EWG who was at university with a prominent cheering scientist. That didn't come to light either.
Well, I'm aware that there were allegations of two conflicts of interest. One we found investigated and was of no substance, we felt, and that person could continue, and the other was one that you just referred to that was removed.
And these both came to light because the patient group representative raised them, not because of any due diligence done by others.
Well,
we knew about one of them because it was very clear that she had what her role was, and we didn't feel that was a conflict, and the group didn't feel that was a conflict. But the other one we didn't know about.
I mean, the underlying wider point here is about trust, isn't it? The patients and those representing patient interests have to have trust in the process. And it's quite difficult to trust a process where something like that comes to light only through the diligence of the patient group. Would you agree with that?
Well, we have we ask people before they join expert advisory groups to declare things. Usually at the start of expert advisory groups, the chair will then again ask anyone to declare any conflicts of interest. And then, you then have to rely on people to declare the conflicts of interest. Clearly, if things come to light, then of course we have to work through it. It's rare for that to happen. It's unfortunate that it happened on this occasion, absolutely. But we always ask, we always get people to declare that.
So you're confident in the process?
But I think clearly we need to reflect also what, if there are cases where conflicts do emerge, I'm talking in general terms, if conflicts do emerge, is the process sufficiently robust? What additional steps should be taken? And certainly I've been in discussions at a European level through the European Management Board in terms of should there be should there be a more formal go and investigate rather than just rely on people's self-declarations.
What's the answer to, what was the conclusion of that discussion?
That I think still the basic premise is to rely on people's self-declaration and honesty. Clearly, if things do come to light, rather than a formal go and investigate absolutely everyone, but I think if things do come to light, clearly action has to be taken. But it's a challenging area.
I mean, the problem here is that I mean, another wider point is that the patient groups feel that they're the ones who have to prove things, fight for things, and make things happen. No one else is doing that, and this is one small but significant example of that.
Well,
it was only the patient group who found out about this conflict of interest, and that the individual then stepped down. I mean, it was a significant issue.
Yeah.
But if it wasn't for the patient group, it wouldn't have come to light, and that's concerning, isn't it? I mean, should they not be learning from that?
I think that's very
in
good.
action, not just.
No, I think that's very good. We need to look at this to make sure that satisfying the process is sufficiently robust.
One of the other things, my last question, one of the other things that you've said in relation to the expert working group, both the one that looked at Wilkinson and the one that's going to be looking at Carl Hennigan's work, is that you're committed to continue to examine evidence in the future. So if new things come to light or new work is done, you'll do that. Is there any limitation on that in terms of how long you're going to continue to do that for in the case of Primodos, and what type of evidence you'd be willing to see examined by an EWG or other body?
I think it will depend on the nature of the evidence that comes forward, and if it's substantive, then we will continue indefinitely. If it's not substantive, then we'll have to form a judgment. Certainly here we had considerable discussions. New evidence comes along, we discussed with ministers and took a view that it was entirely appropriate to get the expert groups, a European one and another national one, to look at this, because it was a major piece of evidence.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so should we go on to Valproate? When Valproate was first licensed, it did carry warnings to doctors about its use in women of childbearing age. Yet we know that women were still being given epilin when they were expecting children or were thinking they might be pregnant. So how did that actually happen? Because I mean, the warnings were there, and yet the women were still, their babies were still being harmed.
I think, well, as you say, I mean, from the very beginning, the warnings have been there. From 1972, the warnings have been there. I mean, we should also understand that Valproate is a very effective drug, and for some women it may be, or some men, for some people, it may be the only effective anti-epileptic. But it does trouble me, and certainly as the evidence has built, it does trouble me that women are still being exposed, or women of childbearing potential are still being exposed, despite the building evidence, despite the very extensive communications that have gone on, despite all the meetings, etc. And I think that the question I keep asking myself, I keep asking June, we talk across the system, is how really with the ever-increasing regulatory steps that we've taken, ever-increasing communication that we've done, getting all the professional societies involved, ministerial meetings, bringing everyone together, lots and lots of ways out into the system. How can we, I mean, it comes back to the question of the levers in the system that we were talking about earlier. How can we really pull the levers with everything, pregnancy prevention plans, etc., all in place to make sure that women don't say that they haven't heard?
It's a huge dilemma, isn't it? And again, it was the patient group that did a survey that showed us that the pregnancy protection plan really was not working. And it was they that brought the information to us. Now, should you not be doing surveys like that to see whether actually what action you've taken is effective?
Well, we certainly have been looking at information to look at the exposures of women in terms of women of childbearing potential who's getting it, or even children who's starting on epilepsy. We've been collecting that data through clinical practice research data link. We've also been working with General Pharmaceutical Council and asking them to go out to the pharmacists and check in terms of things there. We're working with CQC to build that into their audit of practices to make sure that the appropriate regulatory measures are being taken into account. So we've been doing a lot in terms of the enforcement of this, but June, do you want to add to this?
I think it's a very important point that the patients have been able to, by their rapid ability to collect experiences, move this on rapidly. Ian has talked about when a review, and this was a European review, 2 European reviews in fact finishes, there's work underway to look at the behaviours of health professionals and how the drug is being used, and particularly the effects on, if there is other aspects of its effects on pregnancy. But I think that the ability of patient groups to get feedback very quickly through the internet, it's an online survey that's been done, has been invaluable, and I think that's a message going forward. If I could perhaps pause on your first question though, I think what has changed is the availability of alternatives. I think if we look back in time, the risks of Valproate, yes, were known very clearly. It would have a really significant risk of harm in pregnancy. So did phenytoin. So the choices that a woman had would have been very limited for a condition that was life-threatening potentially, at least would stop her living a healthy and productive life. So I think probably the understanding of the role of Epilin, Valproate, and its need in certain conditions is one of the key factors here. But I also think that understanding the risk, and it's probably something that you're reflecting on too, is possibly not shared equally. This is why the women's experience of what that risk is like every day with a child who's been affected is in no way mirrored by points on an IQ scale or cohort studies or whatever our databases are showing us. So I think that's why things have changed in the last 6 years. We need more activities like the patient groups telling us very quickly what is happening in practice.
But on that front, I mean, the Valproate network group didn't get up and running, the patient engagement didn't get up and running until 5-6 years ago, and yet here we have something with sort of known effects for 40 odd years. So that it comes back to how the patients get brought into the system to talk about that everyday experience of what it is like to raise a family where there are all these problems.
It does go, I think, if I'm welcoming your question, to this understanding of risk, and it was really only until we had robust data around 2012-13 that the nature of effects on the children as they grew up became apparent. Now, earlier data on younger children were available, but what we tackled when we led the first review in Europe was the persistence and the permanence of that risk. And at that point, the judgments that were going to be made by health professionals and women were in the context of saying, yes, there should be effective contraception. And then we had to move further to say there must be a pregnancy prevention programme. But I hope I've stressed, and we did in our evidence, that we will be ready to go further. The Valproate Stakeholder Network has simultaneously brought together all parties,
Not just the patients.
the clinical leaders, the compliance bodies, the regulators, the academics and the researchers. We've had 11 meetings with probably about 30 to 40 in each one, and I hope that this is finally achieving the acceptance of risk that needs to be in place. And I think that has been the big challenge here with getting the change that we want to see happen.
So,
in the interest of time, in 1973, the committee's response to the regulators said, well, we better not talk to the patients. We don't want to cause fruitless anxiety. Well, I qualified in 1963, and I can remember the concern about phenytoin. And so Valproate came in 73. You'd have thought they'd have been a bit more aware of the need to communicate with patients then, but I accept medicine was different then, and the answer you gave to Primodos is very clear that this would not be acceptable now. We agreed on that.
And it's interesting that only in 1999 did a leaflet in clear and comprehensible language for someone to be the basis to back up what the clinician had said in those moments when you're trying to absorb perhaps 2 or 3 messages that are fundamental to your life and health, your plans for your family. So that in itself tells you this is very recent, 1999. It's only now that we're able to say people should get those in the language they can understand, those messages.
But we are agreed that what happened then would not be acceptable in this day and age. So that's common ground. What then, going on to where we are now, it really is extraordinary looking back that it has taken so long to actually patients to understand the risk. And even now, you're doing as many things as one can think you could do, and still it's not working. When we last met, you suggested that maybe the way forward was a registry. And we're going to return to that, I think, in some detail this afternoon in another context. But 20,000 people taking Valproate when they're in childbearing age, women. Is that, could you say more about the registry you contemplate and how much that would work?
Yes. Well, perhaps if I set the scene by saying, I think we have common ground between us on what the challenge is. The regulatory position is robust and proportionate. To translate that into meaningful clinical change is where we are. We're building the registry. We've had 2 stakeholder meetings, and common between us is the need for every woman on Valproate, from girlhood or whenever she starts, to be tracked throughout her life, whether she switches to another treatment, has a baby or whatever.
Would you do that through the prescription system? How would you link it?
We are hoping to do it with NHS Digital to pick through, yes.
Right.
But there are some, obviously, details that are still to be defined. Alongside that, from the beginning of April, there will be an incentive to general practitioners through the NHS, quality improvement. And this month...
I just want to, if I may, just concentrate on the registry.
Okay, let's do that.
And, you know, we're very good at the what in the National Health Service. We're not so good at the how. How would this register actually practically work? Would you'd link it to the prescription and the clearinghouse for the prescriptions? How would you make it work?
Yes, and ideally, and we had those discussions with NHS when they were introducing, it's why I mentioned the quality improvement framework, that at the time that the GP is doing that, he knows that all those details need to be on the registry. So that would have been part of it, ideally. Yes.
But would you rely on the GP to register the patient, or would you do it through the prescription, which is cleared centrally, and that would automatically, with patient's permission, which of course would be required under GDPR?
That would be ideal, to make sure it's through the prescription. But I think what we need to do is be sure that at every step that registry is, and the woman's updated details on it, are people's responsibility.
And you're talking to NHS Digital about how technically that can be achieved?
Yes, they've had experience with a couple of registries, and we're reaching out to key people who have done that. Yes, I don't want to overstate where we are. We've had 2 workshops, and you'll be given the details to agree what the purpose and the principles and the various structural issues to do with leadership, which is not just structural. It's the whole passion that should go with delivering this registry, and to make sure that the clinicians are totally behind it. So the actual how is going to follow.
Could you give us a briefing about what you've done and where you're trying to get to on this? It would be very helpful if you could.
Absolutely, yes.
Thank you.
We will provide you with that. And most welcome for any of the team to come to any of the meetings.
Thank you. Right. Yes, that would be very welcome.
We were going to go to the last one, unfortunately. It was just too short time.
Okay, thank you very much. We've heard again from the patient groups that warnings were supplied to clinicians and patients, but these warnings were actually out of step with each other. And and also with the knowledge that was available at that time. And we've heard that certainly there were potential risks that were well known, especially some of the studies that were done on animals, that this was likely to cause huge problems. I'm just sort of wondering, why were there discrepancies with the information that was given to doctors but not to patients? And yet you had your patient information leaflets, which actually didn't chime with the summary of the patient characteristics that doctors were given. It just seems to me that again there really was a disconnect between even just the information that was given out.
It's an important point. I'm very troubled by what you've said, because the leaflet by law has to reflect summary product characteristics, and every safety issue has to be mentioned in equivalent terms, even if the language may be slightly more accessible. And I'd be very concerned, and I don't know if Mrs. Morgan wants to say anything, there would never be any deliberate step not to have a leaflet reflecting a
No, I
an
think if we
SPC.
could have examples to look at, that would be very helpful, and we could...
This is going back over history, so when you're looking at the chronology, you're just seeing that they're not moving in tandem. So we go back to 1994, it's the first time that the patients would have learned that there was a potential risk in the patient information leaflet. And then thereafter, they just don't marry up. So we've done that sort of tracking exercise, and they simply don't marry up as you go through to 2000. They're just simply not aligned. And so for the patients, they would be saying, well, you know, had we known, had we had the opportunity to have that conversation, we might have made different choices.
Well, could you give us the details of this? Because
we can compare and contrast the exercise we've done.
Sure, very happy to look at that and then come back to you on that, because I think I'm not aware anyway, and I can't imagine
and it's actually also something that Sanofi mentioned to us, because they said that there were times and occasions where they wanted to put more into the leaflets, but actually come to the regulators, and there was a sort of different understanding of the science. So it was quite interesting, the debate about what they felt should have gone in, and then months later actually it does go in, but there was something about timing and your different understanding of the scientific evidence that
Can we work through the specifics if you give them to us?
Can I just go back to the current situation with the PPP? Can I just establish what's your view on whether it's working effectively or not? Is it or isn't it?
I think the implementation progress has been disappointing. We took stock of all the perspectives on the 12th of February, our stakeholder meeting, and focused on the data presented by the patient group, in fact, who gave us a further tranche from December to now. Their original data set had been over the summer. You'll recall that the Chief Medical Officer wrote in April, the legal change came into play in May, and the patient group came to us in August with their data, saying that I believe it was 58% didn't get a leaflet, and various other aspects of the implementation weren't working. We were very, very exercised about that, as was our former minister. And the latest set of data, which goes to your question, is slightly better, but nowhere near where it should be. I think the figure was 40% getting the leaflet. Very worryingly, 63% not having had the annual review, which gives them a chance, women a chance to do the risk acknowledgement, because it has to be annual in case a woman's situation has changed, and many will have never thought of having children, then all of a sudden their lives change, and they do. So that has to be done at least annually, and in 2/3 that's not happening. So that is extraordinarily worrying. It's information that we're checking against other data sources. As Dr. Hudson has mentioned, we use the CPRD, we have the Business Services Authority data, and we already know that there's what our patient groups called a postcode lottery, that you are twice as likely to get Valproate in some parts of the country than others. So how systems change, and we know that the NHS will have brilliant practice in some areas, but a slower change process in others. So at the heart of your question is it acceptable nearly 1 year on? And I think none of us would disagree and say it's not acceptable. And it is not acceptable.
No, I'm sure you're right, I think. I think that we can detect your frustration.
Yes.
What needs to be done, and how quickly does it need to happen?
We asked all our stakeholders that on the 12th, 10 days ago. And I think there needs to be a tailored solution, but we looked at where the barriers are and where change isn't happening. I think clearly the specialists, neurologists and paediatricians, really have to deliver. The psychiatry profession has introduced very good guidelines, but all specialists, it is a specialist care drug, need to accept that. The second thing is to improve access to epilepsy nursing. The Association of Epilepsy Nurses really want to do this job, and they need the adequate resources to do it, and are more than willing to bridge that gap. I think then pharmacists need the training and the testing to be sure they talked about women being Valproate safe. We all need to be Valproate safe. So the pharmacist needs to have the knowledge and be tested, because one of the findings of the women was that the people that they asked questions of couldn't help them with those questions. So there are answers, and everybody needs to be very articulate about sharing those and being able to have a conversation. There needs to be a digitally enabled form that is a method of communication between all parties, and I think underpinning that, and it's probably the most challenging of all, has to be contact with those 20,000 women. We were informed early on that access to those names and addresses was not possible because of restrictions. We have checked with particularly with our colleagues in Ireland, and they have done it. So I think that is the fifth element. There needs to be a plan. I'm talking about proposals here, but from what we heard just over a week ago, I think we have to move this to a new level.
I think a lot of what you said we would welcome. I suppose there's a question about the urgency of this. I mean, if the failure is as it's been reported by you just now, the numbers are high in terms of 2/3 is a high proportion. That means that there are women today who could be taking Valproate and about to be pregnant, or even are pregnant. They're exposing themselves and their child-to-be to enormous risk, 1 in 2 risk. So the urgency is overwhelming, isn't it?
Yes,
what kind of immediate or radical action could be taken?
We've obviously used communication tools, but I think we need this package, if I can say, of concerted action. If we can move forward promptly, it would be to contact people. And at the meeting I'm referring to on the 12th, the Business Services Authority was called into the frame as could we institute this contact. Women need a tailored plan. We're told by the specialists that many don't want to come forward because they are concerned that they'll be given advice and their lives are settled in the medicine that's keeping them well and productive. I think we do need to do that really rather in the coming.
So that would be taking information from the prescription form to enable you or others to contact those people directly.
Yes. And I think you've been discussing with colleagues in the NHS about this whole issue, and I think people are ready to consider these matters now.
Well, I put it to you that the one thing that we can do, which we've not tried because we haven't been able to, is actually to put the patients more in charge of their care. And many years ago, Baroness Cumbridge and I were involved in the introduction of the NHS number, and that was so you could actually link the system around the patients. And so the register would enable that to happen. And then the patients themselves and the organisations that support them, the whole system, could then direct the care where it's needed. So what this tells me is that if that analysis is correct, then the sooner we get this register up and running, and it's relatively easy to do this nowadays, where you're talking about the DVLA, you're talking about the National Lottery, you're talking about big registers are not difficult. So we need to get on with it.
I totally support what you said. And we have the key principles now, as of the 12th. We have the model, we have the people, and we have the goal. So with NHS Digital's experience, particularly where they've delivered 2 registries, I think we can move.
Given the risk that women and children to be are exposed to today because of the fact that it's not, that the PPP isn't working, one thing that's been put to us by patient groups is that perhaps the product should be at least temporarily withdrawn from the market or this indication removed to enable the system to put in place the safeguards that you're talking about, so that you don't have this period where the system's trying to do what it wants to do to safeguard women and children, but while it's doing it, women and children continue to be exposed to it.
Well, that course of action as a regulator is always in our minds. When I think I mentioned activities around coproximol failed to secure the appropriate use, it had to be done. Thyroidazine was another one. In the end, it's the ultimate. But here we have, as we understand from clinicians, a medicine that has a unique value for some people, and that there are people who cannot live a normal, healthy, productive life without it. We have to accept that judgment. So the question is how to be proportionate and ensure for a woman, as she moves into her childbearing years or beyond, has access to that tailor-made care and planning so that she is actually fully informed and able to take the decisions and will not have to suffer the consequences of the women and the families you've been talking to.
Do we know what proportion of patients on Valproate are refractory to other treatments?
We're looking at data from all the other member states, which is what we can have access to, as a first start to say, why is it used at the level that it is in this country? And Denmark uses it to a much, much lesser degree. So this is a question that we're raising as often as we can with our neurology colleagues as to how they can actually define, in terms of history, investigation, prognosis, where these patients are and what is the irreducible minimum of colleagues, women who will have to make that choice, a very hard choice, not to have a baby.
Is the PPP attached to other drugs? I mean, the experience of using it elsewhere, and it may be that those other drugs are much rarer and there's a much smaller defined population group, but I'm just wondering, is it a problem specifically with Valproate? Or have you had the same experience trying to make the PPP work when attached to other drugs?
There is a PPP for other powerful teratogens. Thalidomide's back on the market, as are other drugs for multiple myeloma like lenalidomide, pomalidomide, and isotretinoin, as you'll know, for the very severe and skin scarring acne. The context is probably a little different, and the long-standing, if you like, understanding of what has been the challenge with Valproate, understanding what a neurodevelopmental disorder is and so has evolved over time. And I think that question goes to how you change clinical practice when the judgments that have been made have been seemingly acceptable.
But it's about how the PPP is working in other drugs. So
yes,
we seem to have a problem here around compliance. It's not being delivered as it was intended to be. And yet you've got it working with other drugs or not, or your experience with other drugs might have led you to...
We monitor how thalidomide, pomalidomide, lenalidomide, isotretinoin work in practice, and pregnancy prevention is never 100%.
No.
There are always glitches or failures, and we monitor very closely across the EU what the failure rate is, and then take steps.
Is the Valproate PPP problem comparable to what is happening elsewhere, albeit we're dealing with a different population?
I think it is a unique set of circumstances, in fact, because the populations who are having the drugs for myeloma or very short term for scarring acne have a very much perhaps more immediate efficacy component to do the weighing up, and will be in those situations more likely to want to avoid pregnancy rather than someone who's well on epilim and wants to envisage a normal family life.
So, I mean, if you look at, for example, the international examples of pregnancy prevention programs for isotretinoin, the original SMART program was fairly similar to the PPP in that it involved box stickers, it involved the risk acknowledgement, it involved sort of checking that a woman was on contraception. And that was sort of ineffective, essentially. And so it was replaced in 2006 by the iPledge program on my program. So internationally, I appreciate fully it's a different drug and it's a different cohort. But if you have international examples where similar measures haven't worked, how do you sort of analyse those and then utilise them in working out how going forward we can make a PPP work?
Well, we do look at these, and we look very closely at iPledge, in fact, and we have to consider obviously the environment. This was very much a US development.
Yes.
We might think it was over rigorous in terms of the relatively short-term use, and the way a person has to be tested before they get their medicine. And the whole point, I think, of these women who have a condition that's lifelong is to be able to live a normal life and not be constantly bearing the burden of intensive risk minimisation. I don't know if Mrs. Morgan wants to say anything about when we look across at other programmes for teratogens.
I think
what
we've
learned.
tried to take the learnings from particularly our work on isotretinoin. There was a recent review of retinoids throughout Europe and the PPP, and we've tried to take the learnings and include those in the considerations around Valproate, taking into account the very different clinical context.
But I suppose one of the things that struck me about iPlate is being an online programme, it's accessible not just by people who have access to that patient record, but also by pharmacists as well as GPs and everybody else. And it effectively provides you with a register of women of childbearing age taking that medicine. Those seem to me like they would have been very, very valuable things to have.
I think that's where we want to get to with Valproate, and we've had discussions about the summary care record the pharmacist has access to, and how the prescription itself can provide the link between the different health professionals, so that is where we want to get to with Valproate.
Can I just ask a question about the communication of risk? So the mandatory warning went out, as you said, last spring, summer, from the CMO. That went through a central alert, I think I'm right in saying. At that point, it would have gone to CCGs, amongst others. And it would have been for CCGs to act on that by presumably communicating with local GPs and community pharmacies. I presume no one knows how many CCGs did act on it.
Our colleagues at NHS Improvement have that data. I haven't looked at it lately.
We have, there was an NHS Improvement Alert in April 2017 where we have the feedback from the CCGs about the previous communications and the action taken on that. The alert that went from the CMO in April 18 didn't have the feedback loop. It wasn't a patient safety alert, it was a letter from the CMOs. We have, we've tracked through various mechanisms with the materials that Sanofi sent out to healthcare professionals, particularly for pharmacies, to ensure that the packages of materials to pharmacies were actually received and notified as received in the individual pharmacies. So we have that information in terms of feedback.
What we don't know is how many CCGs received the CMO's letter and said to themselves, we need to tell GPs in our patch about what the CMO mandatory warning letter says. We don't know how many did that and how many didn't. Is that right?
I don't have that information. And the CQC is inspecting GP practices, but we don't have the information.
So we don't really know whether that letter had any. I mean, it comes back to Dr. Raine's point about the failings of the PPP. If the messages aren't getting through because they're being delivered to people who don't act on them, if that's the case, we don't know, just like you don't know, then that's clearly a part of the system problem. But not knowing whether it's a problem is also a problem.
Well, we've assured that CQC has Valproate as their test of the safety of the operations of whether it's a GP practice, a hospital or whatever. But then it's down to their making their findings more visible than when we hear about a practice being put in special measures. And we did talk at our stakeholder meeting about much more visibility in that regard.
The other thing that we've heard both from people representing neurologists and representing GPs is a degree of confusion about who's responsible for what here. So neurologists have told us that they don't feel particularly comfortable giving women advice on contraception. It's not what a neurologist does. On the other hand, GPs, I think the Royal College of GPs actually came to one of our hearings and said that it's the role of the neurologist as the principal prescriber to inform a woman about PPP and make sure that that's understood. We've got two conflicting messages here. What's your view on that?
The steps we've taken are to bring, and in fact our former minister brought all the players, all the leading clinicians together to perhaps resolve these, and the deliverable is across Royal College guideline, which is in draft and is about to be agreed. So that should help, because I think it's not simply roles and responsibilities, it's everyone owning the issue and not always thinking it's someone else's. So I think we're nearly there, and the cross Royal College guideline, underpinned by the Valproate guideline from NICE that should be out in March, will help with that. It's bringing together, from the clinical angle, what the woman should experience as a pathway where everyone has the right advice at the right time.
With respect, I mean, in terms of the Royal College of GPs, their membership does not encompass every GP. So although a Royal College guideline, I think, is a fantastic step forward, how does that reach people who aren't members of the college?
Again, it's a good question, it's one that we're aware of. I think the incentive from the NHS, which will go into the quality improvement activities from the 1st of April, will, I hope, then foster the questions of, well, I'm going to be incentivised, I am a very responsible professional, I will look to find what guidance exists, and we'll take away from your question how we can make sure that guideline is then made available. It's the need for the NICE guideline to be available to enable practices to qualify for those additional points.
Right. We're just coming to a close now, which I'm sure you're pleased about. But I want to ask just one final question, because it comes again from a patient group, which was very concerned about the anomalies that they saw in how Valproate was originally licensed. And I don't know if you want to come back to us on that, but clearly they felt that the information was available, it was licensed for 1 year, and it was licensed on condition that patients were monitored for efficacy and safety and so on. And they just felt that actually that was an anomaly, and they didn't want that sort of thing to happen again in another area. But
so I'm not sure. The question, I mean, maybe we should follow up in writing on this, but I'm not entirely sure I understand the question. Why it was licensed only for 1 year, or why?
No, I think the question was related to the fact that the licensing was slightly anomalous, and that the usual clinical evidence base wasn't required. Instead, it was put on a 1 year temporary license.
Right.
So we are going back to 1971.
Yes, it was licensed 72, wasn't it? Put on for 72.
And so I think there were question marks as to how that had happened and why.
I think at the forefront of consideration was the teratogenicity, and I think at that time a study was required to compare it with phenitone. I'll turn to Mrs. Morgan.
Well, I think they had animal data which were concerning at the time of licensing, which was why and also efficacy concerns, which was why they licensed initially to specialist centres for the period of 1 year to collect data to enable further licensing. And from what I can understand, the decision to give it a full license or to stop the restriction to specialist centres was on the basis that it was equivalent in terms of teratogenicity to phenitone. But we can look back and see if there's any further detail.
Because I think the patient group also feel very strongly that there should have been some clinical trials, and you would perhaps inform us whether there were or there weren't. Anyhow, thank you so much for this morning. Very, very grateful.